A Debt Forgotten. Washington, D.C., 1923. Rose Kensington lived alone, but the sound of heavy boots echoed through her house at night. Captain Thomas Sinclair's boots. She knew that sound. And yet, when she checked, the hall was empty except for a single muddy footprint on the rug. Chapter 1. The Echo of War in Georgetown. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 6, its somber tones swallowed by the cavernous silence of the Georgetown house. Rose Kensington paused, a half-filled teacup trembling slightly in her hand. Silence. It was a silence she'd grown accustomed to, a silence that had settled like a shroud over her life 5 years ago, when the telegram arrived. But it was never truly silent, was it? Not inside. She set the cup down on the mahogany table, the delicate china clinking against the polished with a sound that seemed jarringly loud in the stillness. The house, a grand 3-story affair on a quiet, tree-lined street, had once echoed with laughter, with the murmur of conversation, with the hurried footsteps of servants. Now, it was just Rose, the ghosts of her past, and the unsettling creaks and groans of an old house settling into its bones. Or perhaps something more. Rose was 48, though the war had aged her beyond her years. Strands of silver threaded through her auburn hair, pulled back severely into a bun that accentuated the sharp angles of her face. Her eyes, once a vibrant hazel, were now clouded with a perpetual weariness, a weariness that mirrored the faded elegance of the drawing room. The plush velvet curtains, once a rich crimson, were now dusty rose, the intricate Persian rug worn thin in places, mirroring the threadbare state of her own spirit. She tried to maintain the semblance of a normal life. She attended the occasional society tea, volunteered at the local hospital, tending to the wounded veterans who still trickled in, their bodies and minds shattered by the conflict that had reshaped the world. But it was all a facade, a carefully constructed performance to mask the gaping hole in her heart, the unshakable feeling that a part of her had died in the muddy trenches of France, alongside Captain Thomas Sinclair. It had started subtly, a few weeks ago. A misplaced book. A chair moved from its usual position. Then, the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, echoing through the empty hallway in the dead of night. His footsteps. The distinct tread of a soldier's boots, the sound she'd learned to recognize during those stolen, precious moments of his leave in London, before everything changed. The first time, she dismissed it as her imagination, the product of grief and loneliness playing tricks on her weary mind. The second time, she crept to the top of the stairs, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird, a flickering candle held aloft in her trembling hand. The hallway below was empty, bathed in the pale moonlight filtering through the tall, arched windows. But last night had been different. She'd heard the footsteps again, clearer this time, closer. She'd forced herself to go down, her bare feet silent on the thick carpet. And there, in the middle of the hallway, just outside the drawing room, was a single, muddy footprint. A large print, clearly made by a man's boot, the mud still damp, clinging to the intricate floral pattern of the rug. Rose had stared at it for a long time, her breath catching in her throat, a cold dread creeping through her veins. It wasn't the mud itself that terrified her, but the impossibility of it. The doors were locked, the windows secured. No one could have entered the house. And Thomas was dead. She'd knelt down, her fingers tracing the outline of the print, the damp earth cold against her skin. The mud smelled faintly of something familiar, something she couldn't quite place. It was a scent that tugged at the edges of her memory, a scent that evoked images of rain-soaked fields, of damp canvas, of him. Rising slowly, she backed away, her gaze fixed on the footprint as if it might disappear if she looked away. She spent the rest of the night in her armchair, wrapped in a thick shawl, staring into the dying embers of the fire, the unsettling silence of the house pressing down on her like a physical weight. This morning, she had scrubbed the footprint away, the vigorous motion a futile attempt to erase the unease that had settled deep within her bones. But the scent lingered, a faint, ghostly reminder of the impossible. She picked up her teacup again, the the cold liquid sloshing against the sides. She needed to be rational. She needed to be strong. She was Rose Kensington, a woman who had survived the war, who had nursed soldiers back from the brink of death, who had faced loss and heartbreak with unwavering courage. She wouldn't be undone by a footprint. But even as she tried to convince herself, a tiny voice whispered in the back of her mind, a voice that sounded suspiciously like hope, a voice that dared to suggest that perhaps, just perhaps, the impossible was true. That Thomas, somehow, was still alive. A sudden knock on the front door startled her, the sound echoing through the silent house like a gunshot. Rose set the teacup down again, her hand shaking so badly that the china rattled against the saucer. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself, smoothing down the wrinkles in her simple gray dress. Who could it be? She rarely received visitors these days. Her social circle had dwindled since the war, the glittering balls and lavish parties of the past now replaced by somber gatherings and strained conversations about lost loved ones and the uncertain future. She walked to the door, her footsteps measured and deliberate, trying to project an air of calm that she didn't feel. As she reached for the brass handle, she hesitated, a sudden wave of apprehension washing over her. What if it was him? What if it was a ghost? Taking another deep breath, she pulled the door open, revealing a tall, uniformed figure standing on her doorstep, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. For a moment, Rose's heart stopped. It couldn't be. It simply couldn't be. Chapter 2. Whispers of the Missing Captain. The man stepped forward, into the light spilling from the hallway, and Rose's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Thomas. Relief, sharp and immediate, flooded her, followed swiftly by a wave of disappointment so profound it almost buckled her knees. He was a soldier, that much was clear from his uniform, but younger than Thomas would be now, with a neatly trimmed mustache and sharp, intelligent eyes that held a hint of wariness. Sympathy? Rose couldn't quite decipher the emotion that flickered across his face. "Mrs. Kensington?" he asked, his voice low and respectful, with a faint trace of an accent she couldn't place. "Yes," Rose replied, her voice a little shaky. "Can I help you?" "My name is Lieutenant David Miller," he said, extending a gloved hand. "I'm with the War Department. I'm here about Captain Thomas Sinclair." The name, spoken aloud in her quiet hallway, sent a shiver down Rose's spine. It was a name she hadn't heard spoken in years, a name that had been relegated to the realm of memory, of whispered prayers and silent tears. "Captain Sinclair?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "But he's dead?" Lieutenant Miller finished the sentence for her, his gaze unwavering. "That's what the official records say, Mrs. Kensington. But we have reason to believe that might not be entirely accurate." Rose stared at him, her mind reeling. "Not accurate?" she echoed, her heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "What do you mean?" "May I come in, Mrs. Kensington?" he asked, gesturing towards the interior of the house. "This is a rather delicate matter." Rose hesitated for a moment, her instincts warring with her desperate desire to hear what this man had to say. She was a woman alone, in a large, empty house. It wasn't wise to invite a stranger in, especially a soldier, a reminder of the war that had taken so much from her. But the look in his eyes, the earnestness in his voice, convinced her. He wasn't a threat. He was a messenger carrying a glimmer of hope, a hope she'd thought extinguished long ago. "Yes," she said, stepping aside. "Please come in." She led him into the drawing room, the same room where she'd sat just moments before, lost in her memories and her fears. The room seemed different now, charged with a nervous energy, the silence no longer oppressive but expectant. Lieutenant Miller removed his hat, revealing dark, neatly combed hair. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the faded photographs on the mantelpiece, one of which was a portrait of Thomas, taken just before he'd shipped out to France. "A beautiful home, Mrs. Kensington," he said, his voice softening. Captain Sinclair spoke of it often. Rose felt a pang of emotion, a sharp ache in her chest. "He did?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes," Lieutenant Miller replied, turning back to face her. He spoke of you, too. With great affection. He paused, taking a deep breath. Mrs. Kensington, the circumstances surrounding Captain Sinclair's disappearance were unusual. The official report states that he was killed in action during the Battle of the Somme in July of 1918. His body was never recovered. Rose nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She knew the story by heart. She'd read the official report 100 times, searching for some detail, some clue that might offer her a sliver of comfort, a sense of closure. But there was nothing, just the cold, stark facts of his death. But Lieutenant Miller continued, there were rumors, whispers among the men in his regiment. Stories of a secret mission, of a daring raid behind enemy lines. Stories that Captain Sinclair survived. Rose's heart leaped. Survived? She whispered, her voice filled with a fragile hope. But how? That's what we're trying to find out, Mrs. Kensington, Lieutenant Miller said. A few weeks ago, we received information from a reliable source. A French nurse who claims to have treated a British officer matching Captain Sinclair's description in a small, clandestine hospital near the front lines, months after he was officially declared dead. Rose's mind struggled to grasp the implications of his words. Thomas alive? After all this time? It was too much to comprehend. Too much to hope for. A French nurse? She asked, her voice trembling. What did she say? She said he was badly injured, suffering from amnesia, Lieutenant Miller replied. He had no identification, no memory of who he was or where he came from. She called him Le Soldat Inconnu. The unknown soldier. The word sent a chill down Rose's spine. The unknown soldier. It was a term she'd heard often, a symbol of the countless men who had died in the war, their identities lost forever in the chaos and carnage. But to think that he might be one of them, but if he had amnesia, Rose said, her voice filled with a desperate plea. How can she be sure it was him? She described him, Mrs. Kensington, Lieutenant Miller said. His height, his build, his hair, his eyes. She said he had a distinctive scar, just above his left eyebrow, shaped like a crescent moon. Rose gasped, her hand flying to her own forehead, tracing the faint line of a scar she'd received as a child. Thomas had a similar scar, a souvenir from a childhood accident, a detail she'd never shared with anyone except the locket, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Did she mention a locket? Lieutenant Miller's eyes widened slightly. A locket? He repeated. No, she didn't. What kind of locket? It was a silver locket, Rose said, her voice trembling. Engraved with his initials, T.S. inside there was a photograph of me. He always wore it, next to his heart. A flicker of something that looked like excitement crossed Lieutenant Miller's face. Mrs. Kensington, he said, his voice low and urgent, this changes everything. This could be the proof we need. He paused, his gaze searching hers. I need your help, Mrs. Kensington. I need you to tell me everything you know about Captain Sinclair. Every detail, every memory, no matter how insignificant it may seem. We need to find him. We need to bring him home. The request hung in the air between them. This, after all this time believing him to be gone. Could she really allow herself to believe? Chapter 3. The Muddy Footprint and the Unsent Letter. The weight of Lieutenant Miller's words settled upon Rose like a physical burden. Hope, a dangerous, fragile thing, fluttered within her chest, battling against the years of grief and resignation. Could she truly dare to believe that Thomas might be alive? Could she open herself up to the possibility of joy, only to have it snatched away again? I don't know where to begin, Rose stammered, her mind a whirlwind of fragmented memories, of whispered conversations and stolen glances, of the life they had planned together before the war had torn them apart. Start with the locket, Lieutenant Miller suggested gently, pulling a small notebook and pencil from his pocket. Tell me everything you can remember about it. When did he get it? Where did he keep it? Did he ever take it off? Rose closed her eyes, picturing the locket in her mind's eye. It was a small, oval-shaped piece of silver, intricately engraved with his initials, T.S. Thomas Alexander Sinclair. She had given it to him on his 25th birthday, just a few months before he had been deployed. It was a gift, she said, her voice trembling slightly. For his birthday. He loved it. He said it was his good luck charm. He always wore it next to his skin under his uniform. He said it reminded him of me, of what he was fighting for. She opened her eyes, meeting Lieutenant Miller's gaze. He never took it off, she said, her voice firm. He swore he wouldn't. Not until he came home. Lieutenant Miller nodded, scribbling notes in his book. And the photograph inside? He asked. Can you describe it? It was a small, sepia-toned photograph, Rose replied. Taken in my garden, the summer before the war. I was wearing a white dress, with a sprig of lavender in my hair. He said I looked like an angel. A faint smile touched her lips, a bittersweet memory of a happier time. A time before the world had gone mad. And the scar, Lieutenant Miller continued, the one above his left eyebrow. Can you tell me more about that? It was from a childhood accident, Rose explained. He fell out of a tree, trying to rescue a kitten. He was always impulsive, always putting himself in danger for others. A wave of sadness washed over her. A reminder of Thomas's reckless courage, his unwavering sense of duty. It was that very courage, that sense of duty, that had led him to volunteer for the army, to fight for his country, to disappear. Anything else? Lieutenant Miller asked, his gaze intent. Anything at all that might help us identify him? Rose hesitated, her mind searching for some detail, some clue that might have been overlooked. And then, it came to her. The muddy footprint. The scent. The mud, she said suddenly, her voice rising slightly. The footprint in the hallway. It smelled familiar. Lieutenant Miller looked up from his notebook, his eyebrows raised. Familiar? He repeated. In what way? It smelled of earth and something else. Something floral. Like lavender. Lieutenant Miller's eyes widened. Lavender? He echoed. Rose nodded. Thomas, he used to use lavender oil, she explained. He said it helped him sleep. He said it reminded him of home. The home they had planned, with lavender bushes lining the walkway and children's laughter. A dream shattered. A flicker of excitement crossed Lieutenant Miller's face. This is significant, Mrs. Kensington, he said. Very significant. The French nurse, she mentioned that the unknown soldier had a fondness for lavender. She used to put a few drops on his pillow to help him sleep. Rose's heart skipped a beat. It was another piece of the puzzle, another fragile thread connecting Thomas to the unknown soldier. But it still wasn't enough. It wasn't proof. There's something else, she said, her voice hesitant. A letter. I found it after he was declared dead. Hidden in his desk. Lieutenant Miller leaned forward, his interest piqued. A letter? He asked. What kind of letter? It was unsent, Rose explained. Addressed to me. But he never mailed it. She rose from her chair, her legs feeling unsteady. She walked over to the mahogany secretary desk that stood against one wall of the drawing room, its polished surface reflecting the muted light filtering through the curtains. She opened the top drawer, her hand trembling as she reached inside, pulling out a small, worn wooden box. Inside the box, nestled among a collection of old photographs and trinkets, was a single, unopened envelope. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakably Thomas's. This is it, she said, her voice barely a whisper. She handed the envelope to Lieutenant Miller, her heart pounding in her chest. He took it carefully, his fingers tracing the faded script. May I? He asked, gesturing towards the letter. Rose nodded, unable to speak. She watched as he carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the delicate paper within. He began to read, his eyes scanning the lines of text, his expression unreadable. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Rose held her breath, her gaze fixed on Lieutenant Miller's face, waiting for his reaction, for some sign, some indication of what the letter contained. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. Shock, disbelief, and something else. Something that looked like pity. Mrs. Kensington, he said, his voice low and grave. This letter, it changes everything. He looked at her, a question unspoken forming. a darkness threatening. What had Thomas written all those years ago that remained unsaid? Chapter 4. The Society Ball and the Ghostly Waltz. Lieutenant Miller's words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Rose felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. What could the letter possibly contain that would change everything? Had Thomas confessed to some terrible secret? Had he betrayed her, his country, his own sense of honor? What does it say? She asked, her voice trembling, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Lieutenant Miller hesitated, his gaze shifting from the letter to Rose's face, as if weighing his words carefully. "It's complicated, Mrs. Kensington," he said finally. "The letter, it speaks of a mission. A secret mission, far more dangerous than anything Captain Sinclair was officially assigned to." Rose's mind raced. A secret mission? What kind of mission? And why hadn't he told her about it? They had promised each other complete honesty, a pact made in the quiet intimacy of their courtship, a foundation upon which their future was to be built. "He didn't tell me anything," she whispered, her voice filled with confusion and a growing sense of betrayal. "I understand," Lieutenant Miller said gently. "But you must understand, Mrs. Kensington, the nature of war. It forces men to make difficult choices, to keep secrets, even from those they love." He paused, taking a deep breath. "The letter, it suggests that Captain Sinclair was recruited by a clandestine intelligence unit. He was tasked with infiltrating enemy lines, gathering information, making contact with a double agent." Rose stared at him, her mind struggling to grasp the implications of his words. Thomas a spy? It seemed impossible. He was a soldier, a brave and honorable man, but a spy? "But why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why him?" "He was uniquely qualified," Lieutenant Miller explained. "He spoke fluent French, he was familiar with the terrain, and he had a certain resourcefulness, a willingness to take risks." That much was true, Rose thought. Thomas had always been adventurous, drawn to danger, fueled by a restless energy that had both attracted and frightened her. "The letter also mentions a woman," Lieutenant Miller continued, his voice hesitant. "A French woman named Annalise Dubois. She was his contact, his collaborator." The name pierced Rose's heart like a shard of glass. Annalise Dubois. A French woman. Had he fallen in love with her? Was that the secret he had kept from her? The thought was a betrayal, a cold knife twisting in the wound of his supposed death. Was he involved with her? She asked, her voice choked with emotion, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Lieutenant Miller avoided her gaze, his expression unreadable. "The letter doesn't say," he replied. "But it's clear that their relationship was close. Necessary for the mission." Rose felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Close. Necessary. The words echoed in her mind, mocking her, taunting her with their ambiguity. "There's something else, Mrs. Kensington," Lieutenant Miller said, his voice low and serious. "The letter, it ends abruptly, as if he was interrupted. The last sentence is incomplete." He handed the letter back to Rose, his fingers brushing against hers. She took it carefully, her hands trembling as she unfolded the fragile paper. She read the words, her eyes blurring with tears, her heart aching with a pain she thought she had already endured to its fullest extent. The letter was filled with the familiar endearments, the expressions of love and longing that had sustained her through the early years of the war. But then, the tone shifted, becoming more urgent, more secretive. He wrote of the mission, of the risks, of the woman, Annalise. And then nothing. The last sentence trailed off, unfinished, leaving a gaping hole in the narrative, a void of uncertainty. Rose looked up at Lieutenant Miller, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. "What happened to him?" she asked. "What happened after he wrote this letter?" "We don't know," Lieutenant Miller admitted. "That's what we're trying to find out. But the timing of the letter, the abrupt ending, it suggests that something went wrong. Terribly wrong." A sudden, sharp rapping at the door interrupted their conversation. Both Rose and Lieutenant Miller jumped, startled by the unexpected intrusion. Rose rose from her chair, her heart pounding. Who could it be? She wasn't expecting anyone. She walked to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She pulled it open, revealing a young woman standing on her doorstep, dressed in the elaborate finery of an evening gown. "Mrs. Kensington?" the woman asked, her voice bright and cheerful. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I'm here for the ball. The War Relief Society ball. You are hosting, aren't you?" Rose stared at her, her mind blank. The ball. She had completely forgotten. In the midst of the revelations about Thomas, the carefully planned event had vanished from her memory. The War Relief Society, a cause she'd championed even in her grief, now seemed a distant, frivolous concern. Yes," she stammered, her voice weak. "Of course. Please come in." The woman stepped inside, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of Lieutenant Miller, still standing in the drawing room, his uniform a stark contrast to the glittering opulence of her gown. "Oh," she said, her voice faltering slightly. I didn't realize you had company." "This is Lieutenant Miller," Rose said, forcing a smile. "He's with the War Department." The woman's eyes lit up with interest. "The War Department?" she repeated. "How exciting! Are you here on official business?" Lieutenant Miller, recovering his composure, gave a polite nod. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "But I was just leaving." He turned to Rose, his expression serious. "Mrs. Kensington," he said, "will continue this conversation later. I'll be in touch." He gave her a brief, formal bow, then turned and walked out of the house, leaving Rose alone with the unexpected guest and the unsettling weight of the unfinished letter. As the house began to fill with guests, the sounds of chatter and laughter echoing through the halls, Rose moved through the crowd like a ghost, her mind far away, lost in the swirling mists of the past. She danced with a few of the gentlemen, their polite conversation barely registering in her mind. She smiled, she nodded, she played the role of the gracious hostess, but her heart wasn't in it. At one point, she found herself standing alone on the edge of the dance floor, watching the couples swirling around her, their movements graceful and elegant. The music, a lilting waltz, seemed to mock her, reminding her of the nights she had spent dancing with Thomas, his arms strong and secure around her, his eyes filled with love. As she watched, she noticed a figure standing in the shadows, near the doorway. A tall, dark figure, dressed in a uniform that looked strangely familiar. Her heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be. It simply couldn't be. She moved closer, her eyes straining to see through the dim light. The figure turned, and for a moment, Rose thought she saw him. Thomas. His face, pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a haunting sadness. She gasped, reaching out her hand, but the figure vanished, disappearing into the crowd. Rose stood there, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the light? Or was it a ghost? The ghost of the man she had loved, the man she had lost, the man who might still be alive. The music faded, and she felt a cold dread, a certainty that he was closer than she knew, but shrouded. Chapter 5. Secrets in the War Department Files. The ghostly image of Thomas, fleeting and uncertain, lingered in Rose's mind, fueling her growing obsession. The society ball, a blur of faces and forced smiles, ended without further incident, but the seed of doubt and hope had been firmly planted. Sleep evaded her, replaced by a restless turning and the echoing whispers of the unfinished letter. The next morning, Rose found herself drawn to the War Department, an imposing building that held the secrets of a nation and, perhaps, the secrets of her lost love. She had volunteered there occasionally, sorting files and assisting with administrative tasks, a small contribution to the ongoing efforts to deal with the war's aftermath. But today, her purpose was different. She was searching for answers, for any trace of Thomas, for any clue that might confirm the whispers of his survival. She presented herself to the duty officer, a stern-faced woman with a tightly pinned bun, explaining her volunteer status and requesting access to the personnel files. The officer eyed her suspiciously, but Rose's reputation as a respectable widow and a dedicated volunteer eventually swayed her. "You understand, Mrs. Kensington," the officer said, her voice sharp. "These files are confidential. You are not to discuss their contents with anyone." Of course, Rose replied, her voice steady, masking the tremor of anticipation that ran through her. She was led to a dimly lit room, filled with rows upon rows of filing cabinets, their metal surfaces cold and impersonal. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old paper, a scent that evoked a strange sense of both dread and excitement. The officer pointed her to a section labeled Deceased Personnel, European Theater. Rose's heart clenched at the sight of the label, a stark reminder of the official narrative, the narrative she was desperately trying to disprove. She began her search, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the files, her eyes scanning the names, the dates, the brief, impersonal summaries of lives lost. The sheer volume of files was overwhelming, a testament to the brutal scale of the war, the countless men who had vanished into the mud and blood of the trenches. Hours passed, and Rose's hope began to dwindle. She found nothing. Thomas's file was there, just as she expected, confirming his death, his missing body, his official status as killed in action. It was a cold, clinical record of a life cut short, a life that she refused to believe was over. Just as she was about to give up, she noticed a small, unmarked file tucked away at the back of the drawer. It was thinner than the others, almost hidden, as if someone had deliberately tried to conceal it. Her heart skipped a beat. She pulled out the file, her fingers trembling. The cover was blank, with no name, no date, no identifying information. She opened it cautiously, her breath catching in her throat. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper, a handwritten report, filled with cryptic notes and coded messages. The language was a mixture of English and French, the handwriting unfamiliar, but there were references to a mission, a contact, and a double agent. And then she saw it. A name. Annalise Dubois. The French woman from Thomas's letter. Rose's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. This was the connection. This was the proof that Thomas had been involved in something far more complex, far more dangerous, than the official records indicated. She continued to read, her mind racing, trying to decipher the coded messages, to understand the meaning of the cryptic notes. There were references to a meeting, a rendezvous, a location, a small village near the front lines, a place called Verrières. Verrières. The name resonated with Rose, stirring a faint memory. Thomas had mentioned it once, in a letter a long time ago. He had described it as a beautiful, peaceful place, a haven from the horrors of war. A place where he had hoped to. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. A place where he had hoped to take her, after the war. Rose felt a surge of adrenaline, a renewed sense of determination. This was more than just a clue. This was a destination. A place where she might find answers, where she might find him. She carefully copied the contents of the file, her hand trembling, her mind racing with the implications of her discovery. She knew she was taking a risk, breaking the rules, venturing into dangerous territory. But she didn't care. She had to know the truth. She had to find Thomas. As she was leaving the War Department, she saw Lieutenant Miller approaching, his face grim. "Mrs. Kensington," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to talk." He led her to a small, secluded office, closing the door behind them. "I've been doing some digging," he said, his gaze intense. "Following up on the information you provided. The locket, the lavender, the letter, it all points to one thing." He paused, taking a deep breath. "The French nurse, she's identified him, Mrs. Kensington. She's confirmed that the unknown soldier is Captain Thomas Sinclair." Rose's heart leaped with a mixture of joy and disbelief. It was true. He was alive. But Lieutenant Miller continued, his voice heavy with a newfound darkness. "There's more. The nurse, she also revealed something else. Something disturbing." He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. "She said that Captain Sinclair wasn't alone. That he was with someone. A woman. A French woman, named Annalise Dubois." A shadow darkened Rose's joy. Was it the joy of confirmation or the confirmation of betrayal that lurked? Chapter 6. The French nurse with familiar eyes. The revelation hung in the air, a suffocating weight on Rose's chest. Thomas was alive, but his life was entangled with the French woman, Annalise Dubois, the name a constant, painful echo in Rose's mind. The joy of his survival was now tainted by a bitter jealousy, a fear that the man she loved had been irrevocably changed, not just by the war, but by another woman. What did she say about her? Rose asked, her voice trembling, forcing the words out through a throat constricted by emotion. Lieutenant Miller hesitated, his gaze filled with a mixture of sympathy and something else. Something that looked like apprehension. She said they were close, he replied, choosing his words carefully. That they had been through a lot together. That she loved him. The words struck Rose like a physical blow. She loved him. Had Thomas loved her back? Had he replaced Rose, his intended bride, his promised future, with this French woman? And Thomas? Rose whispered, her voice barely audible. Did she say how he felt about her? Lieutenant Miller avoided her gaze. She believes he felt the same, he said softly. But she also said he was confused. That the amnesia, it made him uncertain. About everything. A small, fragile hope flickered within Rose's chest. The amnesia. Perhaps it wasn't a betrayal. Perhaps it was a consequence of his injuries, a temporary state that could be reversed. I need to see her, Rose said, her voice gaining strength, a newfound determination hardening her resolve. I need to see this nurse. Lieutenant Miller looked surprised. Mrs. Kensington, I'm not sure that's I need to see her, Rose repeated, her gaze unwavering. I need to hear it from her. I need to see him. Lieutenant Miller studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be weighing the risks, the potential consequences of her request. It won't be easy, he said finally. She's protective of him. She's been through a lot, taking care of him, hiding him from those who might want to harm him. Rose's mind raced. Harm him? Why would anyone want to harm Thomas? Unless the secret mission. The double agent. The unfinished letter. The mission, she said, her voice urgent. It's not over, is it? Lieutenant Miller nodded grimly. No, Mrs. Kensington, he said. It's not over. And that's why it's dangerous. For him. For her. And for you. But Rose was undeterred. She had come this far. She had faced loss, grief, and the crushing weight of uncertainty. She wouldn't be stopped now. Not when she was so close to finding the truth, to finding him. I understand the risks, she said, her voice firm. But I'm not afraid. I need to see him, Lieutenant. Please. Help me. Lieutenant Miller sighed, a mixture of resignation and perhaps admiration in his eyes. Very well, Mrs. Kensington, he said. I'll arrange it. But you must be prepared. For anything. The arrangements were made swiftly, shrouded in secrecy. Lieutenant Miller, using his contacts within the War Department, managed to locate the French nurse, whose real name was Marie Dubois. Annalise was evidently an alias, another layer of protection in their hidden world. She was living in a small, secluded cottage in the countryside, outside of Paris, caring for Thomas in secret. Rose traveled to France, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The journey was a blur, a whirlwind of train rides and whispered conversations, of furtive glances and coded messages. She felt like a character in a spy novel, a woman caught up in a world of intrigue and danger, a world she had never imagined she would inhabit. Finally, she arrived at the cottage, a small, stone building nestled among rolling hills and fields of lavender, the scent of which immediately brought back a flood of memories, both painful and sweet. Lieutenant Miller, who had accompanied her, knocked on the door. A moment later, it opened, revealing a woman standing in the doorway. It was Marie Dubois. But as Rose looked at her, she felt a jolt of recognition, a strange sense of familiarity. The woman's eyes, they were a striking shade of hazel, with a hint of green around the pupils. Eyes that Rose had seen before in the mirror. Marie was slightly younger than Rose, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, her face weathered by hardship, but there was a strength in her gaze, a resilience that mirrored Rose's own. Mrs. Kensington? Marie asked, her voice soft, with a faint French accent. Yes, Rose replied, her voice trembling. And you are Marie? Marie nodded. Please come in. She stepped aside, allowing Rose and Lieutenant Miller to enter the cottage. The interior was small and sparsely furnished, but clean and tidy. There was a fire burning in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. And then Rose saw him. He was sitting in a chair by the window, his back to the door, gazing out at the fields of lavender. He was thinner than she remembered, his hair longer and unkempt, but there was no mistaking him. It was Thomas. Rose's heart leaped with joy, with relief, with a love that had endured the years, the distance, the uncertainty. But as he turned, her joy turned to something else. Something she couldn't quite define. His eyes were vacant, unfocused, his expression blank. He looked at her, but he didn't see her. He didn't recognize her. "Thomas?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He stared at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Do I know you?" he asked, his voice hesitant, with a faint trace of an accent, a French accent. The question was like a physical blow, a stark contrast to the reality she'd held. The eyes, so like hers, looked on her with a stranger's confusion. Chapter 7. A midnight meeting in the rain. The blankness in Thomas's eyes, the utter lack of recognition, was a crushing blow. Rose had prepared herself for many possibilities, for anger, for resentment, even for a changed man, but not for this emptiness. It was as if the Thomas she had known, the man she had loved, had been erased, replaced by a stranger wearing his face. "Thomas," she repeated, her voice trembling, stepping closer to him. "It's me. It's Rose." He blinked, his brow furrowing deeper. "Rose?" he repeated, the name sounding foreign on his tongue. I don't." Marie stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Thomas's arm. "He doesn't remember," she said softly, her gaze meeting Rose's. "The injuries, they took his memory. He knows nothing of his past." Rose felt a wave of despair wash over her.
It was true, then.
The amnesia was complete. He was lost to her, trapped in a fog of uncertainty, a prisoner of his own mind. "But surely, there's something," Rose pleaded, her voice desperate. "Some flicker of recognition, some spark." Marie shook her head sadly.
"I've tried," she said.
"I've shown him photographs, told him stories, but nothing. It's as if his past has been wiped clean." Rose looked at Thomas again, her heart aching. He was so close, yet so far. She wanted to reach out to him, to touch him, to hold him, but she hesitated, afraid of frightening him, of pushing him further away. Lieutenant Miller, who had been standing silently by the door, stepped forward. "Perhaps if you showed him the locket," he suggested, his voice low. "The one Mrs. Kensington described." Marie hesitated, her gaze shifting to Thomas, then back to Rose. "I don't know," she said. "It might upset him." "Please," Rose begged. "It's the only chance we have. It's a part of him. A part of us." Marie sighed, her expression a mixture of resignation and perhaps a hint of jealousy. She reached into the pocket of her apron, pulling out a small, silver locket. It was the locket. Rose recognized it instantly, the intricate engraving, the familiar weight of it. Marie held it out to Thomas, her hand trembling slightly. "Do you recognize this?" she asked, her voice soft. Thomas took the locket, his fingers tracing the engraved initials, T.S. He turned it over in his hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked at the locket, then at Rose, then back at the locket again. For a moment, Rose thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a spark of recognition, a glimmer of memory. But it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had appeared. "No," he said finally, his voice flat. I don't know it." He handed the locket back to Marie, his expression unchanged. Rose felt her hope crumble, replaced by a crushing disappointment. It was over. He was truly gone. I need some air," she said, her voice choked with emotion. She turned and fled the cottage, rushing out into the cool night air, the scent of lavender now a painful reminder of what she had lost. She walked blindly, her feet carrying her away from the cottage, away from the sight of Thomas, away from the painful reality of his amnesia. She found herself standing in the middle of a field of lavender, the tall, purple stalks swaying gently in the breeze. The tears came then, hot and heavy, streaming down her face. She wept for the man she had loved, for the life they had planned, for the future that had been stolen from them. As she stood there, lost in her grief, she heard a sound behind her. Footsteps, approaching slowly. She turned, her heart pounding, half expecting to see Lieutenant Miller, or perhaps Marie. But it was Thomas. He was standing a few feet away, his face obscured by the shadows, his expression unreadable. "Thomas?" she whispered, her voice trembling. What are you doing here?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at her, his gaze intense. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the sound of the wind rustling through the lavender. Then he spoke. "The rain," he said, his voice low and husky, with a faint trace of his old accent. "It reminds me of something." Rose's heart skipped a beat. The rain. He had always loved the rain. They had spent countless hours together, walking in the rain, talking, laughing, dreaming. "What does it remind you of?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He took a step closer, his gaze searching hers. "I don't know," he said. "A feeling. A memory. Just out of reach." He reached out his hand, his fingers brushing against hers. Rose felt a jolt of electricity, a spark of connection, a flicker of hope. "It's you," he said, his voice suddenly clearer, stronger. "The rain, it reminds me of you." He took another step closer, closing the distance between them. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Rose," he whispered, his voice filled with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. "I remember." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative kiss, a hesitant touch, a fragile reunion. But it was enough. It was a spark, a glimmer, a promise of something more. As they stood there, kissing in the rain, the scent of lavender surrounding them, a sudden flash of lightning illuminated the sky, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. In that brief, fleeting moment, Rose saw something in Thomas's eyes. Something that hadn't been there before. Fear. And then she heard it. A voice, shouting in the distance. A woman's voice. Marie's voice. "Thomas!" she cried. "Thomas, where are you? Get back inside. It's not safe." Thomas pulled away from Rose, his expression suddenly panicked. I have to go," he said. She's right. It's not safe." He turned and ran back towards the cottage, disappearing into the darkness. Rose was left standing alone in the rain, the thunder echoing around her, the scent of lavender now mixed with the metallic tang of fear. The midnight meeting was a stolen moment, and the words were terrifying. Chapter 8. The Locket and the Lost Photograph. The brief, rain-soaked reunion with Thomas, the flicker of memory in his eyes, the urgency of his departure, it all left Rose reeling, a tempest of emotions swirling within her. Marie's frantic call, the fear in Thomas's eyes, it confirmed what Lieutenant Miller had hinted at. The danger was real, and it was closer than she imagined. Back in the cottage, Marie was frantic, pacing back and forth, her face pale with worry. Lieutenant Miller, his expression grim, was trying to calm her down. "He'll be all right," he said, his voice reassuring. "He just needed some air." "You don't understand," Marie said, her voice shaking. "They're looking for him. They know he's alive." "Who?" Rose asked, her voice urgent. "Who's looking for him?" Marie hesitated, her gaze shifting to Lieutenant Miller, as if seeking his permission to speak. He gave a slight nod. "The men he was working against," Marie said finally. "The double agent, he betrayed Thomas. He set him up. They tried to kill him." Rose's heart clenched. The unfinished letter, the secret mission, the betrayal, it was all starting to make sense. Thomas hadn't just been a soldier, he had been a pawn in a deadly game of espionage, a game that was still being played. "But why are they still after him?" Rose asked. "The war is over." "The war may be over," Lieutenant Miller said, his voice grave, "but the secrets, they remain. And some people will do anything to keep them buried." He explained that Thomas's mission had been to uncover a network of spies operating within the Allied forces, a network that was still active, still working to undermine the fragile peace. Thomas had been close to exposing them, to revealing their identities, when he had been betrayed. The double agent, he was a high-ranking officer, Lieutenant Miller said. Someone with access to sensitive information, someone with a lot to lose. And Thomas, he knew his identity? Rose asked. Lieutenant Miller nodded. He did, he said. And that's why they're so desperate to find him. To silence him. Permanently. Rose felt a chill run down her spine. Thomas was in mortal danger, hunted by powerful enemies, his life hanging in the balance. And she was caught in the middle, a pawn in their game, just like him. We need to protect him, she said, her voice firm. We need to get him to safety. Marie nodded, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. I've been protecting him for years, she said. I won't let them hurt him. We need a plan, Lieutenant Miller said, his mind already working, assessing the situation, calculating the risks. We need to get him out of France, back to England, to a place where he'll be safe. They spent the rest of the night huddled around the fire, discussing their options, formulating a plan. It was a dangerous plan, fraught with risks, but it was their only chance. They would use the network of contacts that Marie had established during the war, the same network that had helped her hide Thomas for all these years. As the dawn approached, Rose felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to protect the man she loved, to help him reclaim his life, his memory, his future. She went to see Thomas, who was sleeping soundly in a small bedroom off the main room. She sat beside him, watching him breathe, her heart aching with a mixture of love and fear. She noticed the locket, lying on the bedside table, where Marie had placed it. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the familiar engraving. She opened it, revealing the small, sepia-toned photograph inside. It was the photograph of her, taken in her garden, the summer before the war. She was wearing a white dress, with a sprig of lavender in her hair. She looked so young, so carefree, so innocent. As she gazed at the photograph, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small detail almost hidden in the background. A figure, standing in the shadows, partially obscured by a tree. She held the photograph closer, squinting her eyes, trying to make out the figure. It was a man, dressed in a uniform that looked familiar. Her heart skipped a beat. She recognized the uniform. It was the uniform of a British officer. But it wasn't Thomas. She studied the figure more closely, her mind racing. She recognized the stance, the build, the way he held his head. It was Lieutenant Miller. Rose gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Lieutenant Miller in the photograph taken years before she had ever met him. A wave of nausea washed over her. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But there it was, staring back at her, a silent testament to a hidden truth, a truth that shattered everything she thought she knew. The lost photograph revealed a connection, a link from a time before, a web of secrets far more tangled than she could ever have imagined. Chapter 9. Betrayal at the Embassy. The revelation of Lieutenant Miller's presence in the old photograph sent Rose's world spinning. The man she had trusted, the man who had presented himself as an ally, was somehow connected to Thomas's past, a past shrouded in secrets and danger. Was he truly trying to help, or was he playing a more sinister game? She carefully placed the photograph back in the locket, her mind racing, trying to make sense of this new, unsettling information. She needed to be cautious, to keep her discovery to herself, until she could understand its implications. The plan to get Thomas out of France was set in motion. Marie, using her network of contacts, arranged for a clandestine journey, a series of secret rendezvous and hidden safe houses leading to the coast, where a small fishing boat would take them across the channel to England. Rose and Thomas, accompanied by Marie, left the cottage under the cover of darkness, their journey fraught with peril. They traveled by night, avoiding main roads, hiding in barns and abandoned buildings, constantly looking over their shoulders, fearing discovery. Thomas, though still suffering from amnesia, seemed to sense the danger, his instincts sharpened by years of living on the run. He was quiet and withdrawn, but he followed Marie's instructions without question, his trust in her absolute. Rose watched him, her heart aching. She longed to reach out to him, to tell him about the photograph, about her suspicions, but she couldn't.
Not yet.
She needed to be sure, to gather more evidence before she could risk exposing Lieutenant Miller. They reached Paris, their first major hurdle. The city was crawling with police and military personnel, making it a dangerous place for them to be. They were to meet with a contact at the British Embassy, a man named Mr. Henderson, who was supposedly a friend of Marie's, someone who could provide them with false papers and safe passage out of the city. Rose was uneasy about the meeting. The embassy seemed too obvious, too exposed. But Marie insisted that Mr. Henderson was trustworthy, that he had helped them before. They arrived at the embassy under the cover of darkness, slipping through a side entrance, their hearts pounding with apprehension. Mr. Henderson, a tall, thin man with a nervous demeanor, greeted them in a small, secluded office. "You made it," he said, his voice hushed. "I've arranged for your papers. They should be ready tomorrow." He handed Marie a sealed envelope, his hand trembling slightly. "This contains your instructions," he said. "Follow them carefully.
And be careful.
There are eyes everywhere." Rose felt a growing sense of unease. Mr. Henderson seemed overly nervous, his eyes darting around the room, as if he expected to be discovered at any moment. Suddenly, the door burst open, and two men in military uniforms stormed into the room, their guns drawn. "Freeze!" one of them shouted. "You're under arrest." Rose gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. They had been betrayed. Thomas, reacting instinctively, pushed Marie and Rose behind him, shielding them from the armed men.
"Run,"
he shouted. "Get out of here." Marie, her eyes wide with fear, grabbed Rose's hand and pulled her towards a back door, hidden behind a heavy curtain. They fled the office, their footsteps echoing through the empty corridors of the embassy. They burst out into the night, finding themselves in a small, enclosed courtyard. The rain was falling heavily, soaking them to the bone. They could hear the shouts of the soldiers behind them, their pursuers closing in. "This way," Marie said, pulling Rose towards a narrow alleyway that led away from the embassy. They ran, their lungs burning, their hearts pounding, the sound of the rain and the pursuing footsteps echoing around them. As they reached the end of the alleyway, they saw a figure standing in the shadows, blocking their path. It was Lieutenant Miller. Rose's heart sank. He had betrayed them. The photograph, the hidden connection, the carefully constructed facade, it had all been a lie. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice cold and menacing, a gun in his hand. Marie gasped, stepping in front of Rose, shielding her from the lieutenant. "You," she said, her voice filled with anger and betrayal. "You set us up." Lieutenant Miller smiled, a cruel, chilling smile. "I had to," he said. "It was the only way." Rose stared, numb with terror. Thomas shouted from inside. A crash followed. It was a trap, and they had walked straight into it. Chapter 10. The coded message in the silk scarf. Lieutenant Miller's betrayal was a devastating blow, confirming Rose's worst fears. He had played them all, manipulating them, using their trust and vulnerability to achieve his own sinister goals. But what were those goals? What did he want with Thomas? "Why, Miller?" Rose demanded, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "Why are you doing this?" Miller's smile widened, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Let's just say I have a vested interest in Captain Sinclair's silence," he said. "He knows too much. He's a threat. He doesn't remember anything." Rose protested. "He has amnesia." "That's what you think," Miller sneered. "But amnesia can be temporary. Memories can return. And I can't risk that happening." He gestured with his gun towards the alleyway. "Now, be good little ladies and come with me," he said. "Unless you want to end up like your friend." Rose's heart clenched. Thomas. What had they done to him? Marie, her eyes blazing with defiance, stepped forward. "We won't go with you," she said. "You'll have to kill us first." Miller laughed, a cold, heartless sound. "Don't tempt me," he said. "I have no problem with killing. I've done it before." He raised his gun, aiming it at Marie. Rose knew they were trapped, outgunned, with no way to escape. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows behind Miller. It was Thomas. He had escaped from the embassy, somehow managing to evade the soldiers. He was bruised and bleeding, but his eyes were filled with a fierce determination. He lunged at Miller, tackling him to the ground. The gun went off, the shot echoing through the narrow alleyway. Rose screamed, her heart stopping. She couldn't see who had been shot, the two men struggling in the darkness, a tangle of limbs and angry shouts. Marie, seizing the opportunity, grabbed Rose's hand and pulled her away, running back towards the embassy. "We have to get help," she said, her voice breathless. They ran back through the corridors, their footsteps echoing through the empty building. They found a telephone, and Marie quickly dialed a number, speaking rapidly in French. "It's the police," she explained to Rose. "I know someone I can trust." They waited, their hearts pounding, listening to the sounds of the struggle coming from the courtyard. Rose was terrified for Thomas, praying that he was still alive. Finally, they heard the sirens, the sound of police cars approaching. The soldiers who had arrested them burst out of the office, their faces panicked. They saw Marie and Rose and started towards them, but it was too late. The police stormed into the embassy, their guns drawn, arresting the soldiers and securing the building. Rose and Marie rushed back to the courtyard, their hearts filled with dread. They found Thomas lying on the ground, his body still and lifeless. Miller was gone. Rose knelt beside Thomas, her tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered. "No, please no." She cradled his head in her lap, her fingers stroking his hair. He was cold, his skin pale. Marie knelt beside her, her face filled with grief.
He's gone," she said softly.
Rose refused to believe it. She felt for a pulse, her fingers desperately searching for a sign of life. And then she felt it. A faint, weak beat, a flicker of life beneath her fingertips. "He's alive,"
she cried.
"He's still alive." The police called for a medic, and Thomas was rushed to a nearby hospital, his condition critical. Rose and Marie waited anxiously, praying for his survival. The hours stretched on, agonizingly slow, each tick of the clock a reminder of the fragility of life. Finally, a doctor emerged from the operating room, his face weary but hopeful. "He's stable," he said. "But he's lost a lot of blood. He needs time to recover." Rose and Marie were allowed to see him, briefly. He was lying in a bed, his body hooked up to machines, his face pale and drawn. But he was alive. As Rose sat beside him, holding his hand, she noticed something clutched tightly in his fist. It was a small, silk scarf, a scarf that Marie had been wearing earlier that evening. She carefully pried it from his grip, unfolding it gently. It was a beautiful scarf, embroidered with intricate patterns and something else. A series of small, almost invisible stitches, forming a coded message. Rose's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the code. It was the same code used in the War Department file, the file that had led her to Verriers. She realized that Marie had been communicating with someone, sending secret messages, using the scarf as a hidden medium. But who was she communicating with? And what did the message say? Rose knew she had to decipher the code, to uncover the truth behind Marie's secret communication. It was the key to understanding the web of deception that surrounded them, the key to exposing Miller and his accomplices, the key to saving Thomas. This scarf and its message pointed to another player, another layer, a hidden truth Rose had yet to fully uncover. Chapter 11. Escape from the Shadows. The discovery of the coded message in Marie's silk scarf added another layer of complexity to the already tangled web of deception. Rose was determined to decipher the code, convinced that it held the key to understanding the forces arrayed against them and, ultimately, to protecting Thomas. While Thomas recovered in the hospital, under the watchful eye of the French police, Marie's trusted contact, having proven invaluable, Rose dedicated herself to breaking the code. She remembered the War Department file, the cryptic notes and symbols, and realized that the scarf stitches were a variation of the same cipher. It was painstaking work, requiring hours of concentration, cross-referencing the stitches with the notes she had copied from the file. The hospital room, with its sterile smell and the constant beeping of machines, became her sanctuary, a place where she could focus on the task at hand, shutting out the fear and uncertainty that gnawed at her. Marie, initially reluctant to discuss the scarf, eventually revealed that it was a communication method she had used during the war, a way to exchange information with a network of resistance fighters. She claimed she hadn't used it since Thomas's injury, that the message must be old, irrelevant. But Rose sensed a lie, a subtle hesitation in Marie's voice, a flicker of fear in her eyes. After days of relentless effort, Rose finally cracked the code. The message, a series of seemingly innocuous phrases, revealed a meeting place and a time. The old windmill, Verriers, midnight, 3 days hence. Verriers. The village where Thomas had been taken after his injury, the place where Marie had nursed him back to health, the place mentioned in the War Department file. It was all connected. Rose's heart pounded. The message was clearly intended for someone involved in the conspiracy, someone who was still actively working against Thomas. And the meeting was imminent. She knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't trust the French police entirely, not knowing how far Miller's influence reached. She had to get to Verriers, to uncover the identity of the person Marie was communicating with, to expose the conspiracy and protect Thomas. She confronted Marie, showing her the deciphered message, demanding answers. Marie, cornered and exposed, finally broke down, confessing the truth. She admitted that she was still in contact with members of the wartime resistance network, but claimed that her intentions were pure. She believed that some of them could help protect Thomas, that they had the resources and the connections to get him out of danger. I was trying to help him, Rose, she pleaded, her voice filled with desperation. I swear it. I would never do anything to hurt him. Rose wanted to believe her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, that Marie was still holding something back. The look in her eyes when Rose first arrived, the way her features mirrored her own. There was a connection there, a history. Who are you meeting at the windmill? Rose demanded. Who is your contact? Marie hesitated, her eyes filled with fear. I can't tell you, she said. It's too dangerous. They'll kill me, they'll kill him. Rose knew she had to convince Marie to trust her, to reveal the identity of her contact. She had to make her understand that they were on the same side, that they both wanted to protect Thomas. Marie, she said, her voice softening, I know you care about Thomas. I see it in your eyes. I feel it in your touch. But we can't protect him if we're working against each other. We need to work together. Please, tell me who your contact is. Marie looked at Rose, her gaze searching hers, as if weighing her trustworthiness. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. His name is Jean-Luc, she said. He was my brother. Rose's heart skipped a beat. Her brother. The resemblance, the shared features, the connection she had sensed, it all made sense now. Marie was not just Thomas's caretaker, she was family, bound to him by blood and loyalty. Or was there a further meaning? The name felt important. We have to go to Verriers, Rose said, her voice firm. We have to stop them. They knew it was a risky plan, venturing back into the heart of the danger, but they had no choice. They had to confront Jean-Luc, to uncover his role in the conspiracy, to expose the truth and protect Thomas. With Thomas still recovering in the hospital, Rose and Marie made their escape, slipping out of Paris under the cover of darkness, using the same clandestine routes they had used before. They traveled by night, avoiding main roads, hiding in safe houses, relying on the network of contacts that Marie had established during the war. The journey was tense and fraught with peril, but they were driven by a shared purpose, a determination to protect the man they both loved, each in their own way. As they approached Verriers, the familiar landscape, the rolling hills and fields of lavender, stirred a mix of emotions in Rose: hope, fear, and a growing sense of dread. They arrived at the old windmill, a crumbling stone structure perched on a hilltop overlooking the village, just as the clock struck midnight. The wind was howling, whipping around them, the darkness broken only by the faint glimmer of the moon. They waited, hidden in the shadows, their hearts pounding, their eyes scanning the darkness. And then they saw him, a figure approaching the windmill, his face obscured by the shadows. It was Jean-Luc, Rose and Marie stepped out of the shadows, confronting him. Jean-Luc, Marie said, her voice trembling. It's me. It's Marie. He stopped, his gaze darting with surprise. He was much older than Rose imagined, his face worn. His eyes, though, were the familiar hazel. This was the start of a new revelation. Chapter 12. Reunion in the Ruined Church. Jean-Luc's surprise quickly turned to suspicion, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Marie and Rose, standing together in the darkness. The wind whipped around them, the old windmill creaking ominously, a fitting backdrop for the tense confrontation.
Marie?
He said, his voice guarded, with a thick French accent. What are you doing here? And who is this? This is Rose Kensington, Marie replied, her voice trembling slightly. She's Thomas's fiancée. Jean-Luc's eyes widened, his gaze shifting to Rose, scrutinizing her face, as if searching for some sign of deception. Fiancé? He repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. But Thomas, he remembers, Rose interrupted, her voice firm. He remembers me. He remembers everything. It was a bluff, a calculated risk. She knew that Thomas's memory was still fragmented, his past shrouded in uncertainty. But she needed to gain the upper hand, to make Jean-Luc believe that they had the advantage. Jean-Luc hesitated, his gaze shifting between Marie and Rose, his mind clearly racing, trying to assess the situation. I don't believe you, he said finally. Thomas, he was with us. He was one of us. He would never. He was used, Rose interrupted again, her voice rising with anger. He was betrayed. By you, by Miller, by all of you. Jean-Luc's eyes flashed with anger. You know nothing, he said, his voice low and menacing. You don't understand the stakes. I understand that Thomas is in danger, Rose retorted. And I understand that you're involved. You're the one who's been communicating with Marie, sending her coded messages. She pulled out the silk scarf, holding it up in the dim light.
This is your code, she said.
I deciphered it. I know about the meeting. I know about everything. Jean-Luc stared at the scarf, his face paling. He realized that he had been exposed, that his carefully constructed lies were crumbling around him. Marie, he said, his voice pleading, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you haven't betrayed us. Marie looked at her brother, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else. Something that looked like guilt. I did what I had to do, she said softly. To protect him. To protect all of us. Jean-Luc shook his head, his expression filled with disbelief and betrayal. You don't understand, he said. They'll kill us all. Suddenly, a shot rang out, the sound echoing through the night. Jean-Luc gasped, clutching his chest, his body crumpling to the ground. Rose and Marie screamed, their eyes widening in horror. They looked around, frantically searching for the source of the shot. They saw a figure emerging from the shadows, a figure holding a gun. It was Lieutenant Miller. He had followed them, tracked them down, just as Rose had feared. You shouldn't have come here, he said, his voice cold and menacing. Now you'll pay the price. He raised his gun, aiming it at Rose. Marie, reacting instinctively, pushed Rose out of the way, shielding her with her own body. Another shot rang out, and Marie gasped, collapsing to the ground, her body falling on top of Jean-Luc's. Rose cried out, her heart shattering. She knelt beside Marie, cradling her head in her lap. Marie, she whispered. No, please no. Marie looked at Rose, her eyes filled with pain and regret. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice weak. I should have told you sooner. Told me what? Rose asked, her tears streaming down her face. What is it, Marie? Please tell me. Marie took a deep breath, her body trembling. Thomas, he's not who you think he is, she whispered. Her voice trailed off, her eyes closing, her body going limp. She was gone. Rose stared at Marie's lifeless body, her mind reeling. What had Marie been trying to tell her? What secret had she died protecting? Thomas, not who she thought he was. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, her heart pounding, expecting to see Miller, his gun still raised. But it wasn't Miller. It was Thomas. He had followed them, somehow managing to escape from the hospital, to track them down. He was bruised and battered, his clothes torn and blood-stained, but his eyes were clear, focused, filled with a fierce determination. He saw Rose, kneeling beside Marie's body, his expression changing to one of horror and grief.
"Rose!" he cried.
"What happened? What's going on?" He rushed to her side, kneeling beside her, his hands gently touching Marie's face. She's gone," Rose whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Miller, he shot her. He shot Jean-Luc." Thomas looked at Jean-Luc's body, his eyes widening in recognition.
"Jean-Luc?"
he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "But he stopped, his eyes widening further, his mind suddenly flooded with memories. He remembered Jean-Luc, his childhood friend, his comrade in arms, his brother. He remembered Marie, his sister, his protector, the woman who had saved his life, the woman who had hidden him from his enemies. He remembered the mission, the betrayal, the double agent Miller. He remembered everything. "Rose," he said, his voice trembling, his eyes filled with tears. I remember it all." He pulled her close, holding her tightly, his body shaking with emotion. Rose clung to him, her tears mingling with his, a mixture of grief, relief, and love. They were together again, reunited in the ruins of a war-torn village, surrounded by the bodies of their loved ones, facing an uncertain future. But they were together, and that was all that mattered. As they held each other, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale light over the ruined church nearby. The church, its roof partially collapsed, its windows shattered, stood as a silent witness to the tragedy that had unfolded, a symbol of the destruction and the resilience of the human spirit. It was there, in the remnants of hope and destruction, that Thomas and Rose would begin to heal. Chapter 13. The Price of Silence. The return of Thomas's memory, triggered by the shock of seeing his siblings gunned down, was a bittersweet victory. While it brought them closer, it also illuminated the terrible truth of their situation, the depth of Miller's betrayal, and the deadly conspiracy that still threatened them. They couldn't stay at the windmill, exposed and vulnerable. They sought shelter in the ruined church, a somber sanctuary that offered a semblance of protection from the elements and prying eyes. The air inside was heavy with the scent of dust and decay, a reminder of the war's devastation and the fragility of life. Thomas, his memory now flooding back, recounted the details of his mission, the intricate web of espionage and betrayal that had led him to this point. He explained that Miller had been his commanding officer, his mentor, the man he had trusted implicitly. But Miller had been a double agent, working for a shadowy organization that sought to profit from the war's chaos and destabilize the fragile peace. "They call themselves the Circle," Thomas said, his voice low and grave. "They're a group of powerful men, industrialists, politicians, military leaders, all seeking to control the world's resources, to manipulate governments, to profit from conflict." He explained that his mission had been to infiltrate the Circle, to gather evidence of their activities, to expose their crimes. He had been close to succeeding, to revealing their identities, when Miller had betrayed him, setting him up to be killed. "Jean-Luc, he was my contact within the Circle," Thomas said, his voice choked with emotion. "He was feeding me information, helping me build a case against them. But Miller, he found out. He silenced him and Marie." Rose listened, her heart aching for Thomas, for the loss of his siblings, for the burden of his past. She realized that Marie's dying words, "Thomas, he's not who you think he is," had been a reference to his true identity, his connection to Jean-Luc and the resistance network. "We have to expose them, Thomas," Rose said, her voice firm. "We have to bring them to justice." Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We will," he said. "But we need to be careful. They're powerful, they're ruthless, and they have eyes everywhere." They knew they couldn't trust the authorities, not knowing how far the Circle's influence reached. They had to find a way to expose them, to reveal their crimes to the world, without putting themselves in further danger. They decided to return to England, to seek help from someone Thomas trusted, someone outside of the Circle's reach. A former colleague, a man named Sir Arthur Barrington, a retired intelligence officer known for his integrity and his unwavering commitment to justice. The journey back to England was fraught with peril. They traveled in disguise, using false identities, avoiding main roads, constantly looking over their shoulders, fearing discovery. They reached London, a city scarred by war but slowly rebuilding, a city that held both hope and danger for them. They contacted Sir Arthur, arranging a secret meeting, a rendezvous in a secluded park, far from prying eyes. Sir Arthur, a tall, imposing figure with a distinguished air and a sharp, piercing gaze, listened intently to their story, his expression growing graver with each revelation. "I knew Miller was a snake," he said, his voice filled with disgust. "I never trusted him, but I had no idea how deep his treachery went. He agreed to help them, to use his connections and his influence to expose the circle and bring them to justice. But he warned them that it would be a dangerous undertaking, that they would be facing powerful enemies. They will stop at nothing to protect themselves," he said. "They have killed before, and they will kill again. You must be prepared for anything." They spent the next few days in hiding, working with Sir Arthur, gathering evidence, preparing their case. They knew that time was running out, that the circle would be searching for them, that they had to act quickly before they were silenced. One evening, as they were working late into the night, reviewing documents and planning their next move, they heard a noise outside their hiding place, a faint scratching sound. Thomas, his senses sharpened by years of living on the run, immediately recognized the sound. It was a signal, a coded message, used by members of the circle. They were found. They knew they had to escape, to flee before the circle's agents stormed their hiding place. But as they were preparing to leave, Thomas stopped, his eyes fixed on a small, wooden box sitting on a table. It was the box that Rose had found at his desk, the box that contained the unsent letter, the letter that had started it all. "I need to take this," he said, his voice urgent. "There's something important inside." Rose hesitated, her instincts warning her against delaying their escape. But she saw the look in Thomas's eyes, the determination, the need. "All right," she said, "but be quick." Thomas opened the box, his fingers rummaging inside. He pulled out the letter, unfolding it gently. He scanned the pages, his eyes searching for something specific. And then he found it, a small, almost invisible mark, hidden within the text, a symbol that he recognized. It was the circle's symbol. Rose gasped, her heart pounding. The letter, it wasn't just a confession, a record of his mission. It was a clue to the identity of the leader of the circle, the mastermind behind the conspiracy. The seemingly innocuous letter held a far greater weight, a darkness that had been hidden in plain sight. Chapter 14. The Confession in the Candlelight. The discovery of the circle's symbol within the unsent letter sent a jolt of adrenaline through Rose and Thomas. It was a breakthrough, a crucial piece of the puzzle that could expose the entire conspiracy. But it also raised a terrifying question: who had placed the symbol there, and why? They had no time to ponder the implications. The scratching sound outside their hiding place grew louder, more insistent. The circle's agents were closing in. They fled the building, slipping out into the dark, rainy streets of London, their hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline. They ran blindly, their footsteps echoing through the empty alleyways, the sound of the rain masking their escape. They found refuge in an abandoned warehouse, a dilapidated structure on the outskirts of the city, a place where they could hide, regroup, and examine the letter more closely. The warehouse was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. They lit a single candle, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, creating an eerie, almost surreal atmosphere. They huddled together, their bodies trembling with cold and fear, the unsent letter spread out on the floor before them. Thomas pointed to the symbol, a small, intricate design, almost invisible to the naked eye. "It's their mark," he said, his voice low and tense. "The symbol of the circle. But it's not just a symbol. It's a code." He explained that the circle used a complex system of codes and ciphers to communicate, to conceal their identities, to protect their secrets. The symbol, he believed, was a key, a way to unlock the code, to reveal the identity of the leader. Rose remembered the coded message in Marie's silk scarf, the War Department file, the cryptic notes and symbols. It was all connected, a vast, intricate web of deception, woven by the circle to conceal their crimes. They spent hours poring over the letter, examining every word, every sentence, every punctuation mark, searching for clues, for patterns, for anything that might help them decipher the code. The candle burned low, its flame flickering precariously, threatening to plunge them into darkness. The silence in the warehouse was broken only by the sound of the rain drumming on the roof, the scratching of mice in the walls, and the occasional whisper between Rose and Thomas. As the hours passed, Rose began to feel a growing sense of despair. The code seemed impenetrable, the symbol a mocking riddle, a secret that refused to be unlocked. But Thomas was relentless, his determination unwavering. He refused to give up, driven by a burning desire for justice, for revenge, for closure. And then he saw it. A pattern, hidden within the text, a sequence of letters that repeated itself, subtly altered each time. "I've got it," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "It's a substitution cipher. Each letter represents another letter, based on its position within the symbol." He explained the code, how it worked, how to decipher it. Rose listened, her mind racing, trying to keep up with his rapid-fire explanation. They worked together, painstakingly deciphering the coded message, letter by letter, word by word. The candle flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls, as the hidden message slowly began to reveal itself. Finally, they had it. The complete message, decoded and translated. It was a name, a single name, written in clear, unmistakable text. Rose gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The name, it was someone she knew, someone she had trusted, someone she had considered a friend. It was Sir Arthur Barrington, the retired intelligence officer, the man who had offered them help, the man who had promised to expose the circle. He was their leader. He was the mastermind behind the entire conspiracy. Rose felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The betrayal was profound, the deception complete. Sir Arthur had played them all, manipulating them, using their trust and vulnerability to protect himself and his organization. "He knew," Thomas said, his voice filled with anger and disbelief. "He knew all along. He was playing us from the very beginning." They realized that their meeting with Sir Arthur, the evidence they had shared with him, the plan they had formulated, it had all been a trap. He had been leading them into a carefully orchestrated ambush, intending to silence them permanently. The scratching sound returned, louder this time, closer. They knew they had to escape, to flee before Sir Arthur's agents found them. But as they were preparing to leave, Rose stopped, her gaze fixed on Thomas's face. "There's something else," she said, her voice trembling. "Something I need to tell you." She told him about the photograph, the one she had found in the locket, the photograph that showed Lieutenant Miller standing in the background, years before they had supposedly met. Thomas listened, his expression growing darker with each word. He realized that Miller's betrayal had been even deeper, even more personal than he had imagined. He looked at Rose, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and understanding. "It all makes sense now," he said, his voice low and heavy. "The amnesia, the confusion, the feelings I had for Marie. It was all manipulated. By Miller. By Sir Arthur." He explained that Sir Arthur had used his knowledge of Thomas's past, his relationships, his vulnerabilities, to control him, to erase his memory, to turn him into a weapon, a pawn in their game. Rose reached out to him, her hand gently touching his face. "It wasn't your fault, Thomas," she said, her voice filled with compassion. "You were a victim, just like all of us." In this shared moment, in the candlelight, the last of their secrets were spoken, raw and painful. Chapter 15. The Scar That Never Healed. The shared confession, the unveiling of Sir Arthur's treachery and Miller's long-standing manipulation, brought a strange sense of clarity amidst the chaos. Rose and Thomas, stripped bare of their illusions, found solace in their shared vulnerability, their bond strengthened by the crucible of betrayal. They knew they couldn't stay in the warehouse. Sir Arthur would be searching for them, his net closing in. They had to disappear, to vanish without a trace, to find a way to fight back from the shadows. They left the warehouse under the cover of darkness, slipping through the rain-soaked streets of London, their senses heightened, their every move calculated. They were fugitives, hunted by a powerful enemy, their lives hanging in the balance. They found refuge in a small, unassuming boarding house in a quiet, forgotten corner of the city, a place where they could blend in, disappear among the anonymous crowds. They used false names, altered their appearances, and adopted a cautious, low-profile existence. They spent their days planning, strategizing, searching for a way to expose Sir Arthur and the Circle. They knew they couldn't go to the authorities, not with Sir Arthur's influence reaching into the highest levels of government. They had to find another way, a way to bring their crimes to light without putting themselves in further danger. Thomas, his memory fully restored, remembered details of his mission, names of contacts, locations of secret meetings, pieces of evidence that could be used to build a case against the Circle. He also remembered something else. Something that had been buried deep within his subconscious, a memory that had resurfaced during his confession. He remembered a scar. Not the one above his eyebrow, the one Marie had used to identify him, but another scar, a hidden scar, a mark that he had carried since childhood. It was a small, almost invisible scar, located on his left shoulder, hidden beneath his shirt. He had gotten it during a childhood accident, a fall from a tree, the same accident that had resulted in the scar above his eyebrow. But this scar was different. It had been altered. Someone had tampered with it, deliberately changing its shape, making it look different. He remembered the day it had happened. He was a young boy, living in a small village in France, with his brother, Jean-Luc, and his sister, Marie. He had fallen from the tree, injuring his shoulder. His father, a doctor, had treated the wound, stitching it up carefully. But then, a few days later, a man had come to their house, a man he didn't recognize, a man with a cold, menacing presence. He had introduced himself as a friend of his father's, a doctor from a nearby city. He had examined Thomas's shoulder, saying that the wound wasn't healing properly. He had taken Thomas into another room, alone, and altered the scar. Thomas remembered the pain, the fear, the feeling of being violated, of being marked. He had never understood why the man had done it, why he had deliberately changed the shape of his scar.
But now he realized.
The scar, it was a marker, a symbol, a way for the Circle to identify their agents, their operatives, their children. He realized that he, Jean-Luc, and Marie had all been marked, from a young age, groomed to serve the Circle, their lives manipulated, their destinies predetermined. He realized that his father, the man he had loved and respected, had been a part of it, a member of the Circle, a willing participant in their crimes. The revelation was a devastating blow, shattering his remaining illusions, destroying his sense of self, his understanding of his past. He shared his discovery with Rose, his voice trembling with emotion, his eyes filled with pain and shame. Rose listened, her heart aching for him, for the betrayal he had endured, for the burden of his past. She held him close, offering him comfort, support, and love. "It wasn't your fault, Thomas," she said, her voice soft and gentle. "You were a child. You had no choice." She helped him understand that the scar was not a mark of shame, but a symbol of his resilience, his strength, his ability to survive. It was a reminder of the horrors he had endured, but also a testament to his courage, his determination to fight back, to break free from the Circle's control. They knew that the scar, the altered scar, was a crucial piece of evidence, a way to expose the Circle's methods, their reach, their depravity. It was a way to prove that they had been manipulating children, grooming them for their own sinister purposes, for generations. They decided to use the scar, to reveal it to the world, to expose the Circle's crimes and bring them to justice. But they knew it would be a dangerous gamble, a move that would put them directly in the crosshairs of their enemies. It was, however, a story they had to tell. Chapter 16. The Promise Broken by War. The decision to use Thomas's altered scar as a means of exposing the Circle was a desperate gamble, a high-stakes maneuver that could either bring them victory or lead to their demise. They knew that Sir Arthur would stop at nothing to protect himself and his organization, that he would use all his power and influence to silence them permanently. They needed a plan, a way to reveal the scar to the world without putting themselves in immediate danger. They couldn't go to the mainstream media, not with Sir Arthur's control over the press. They needed an alternative, a way to bypass the established channels, to reach the public directly. They decided to contact a small, independent newspaper, a publication known for its investigative journalism and its willingness to challenge the powerful. It was a risky move, but it was their only chance. They arranged a secret meeting with the newspaper's editor, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, a seasoned journalist with a reputation for fearlessness and integrity. They met in a dimly lit cafe, a secluded corner booth offering a semblance of privacy. Thomas recounted his story, his voice filled with emotion, his eyes revealing the pain and trauma he had endured. He showed Sarah the scar, the altered scar, explaining its significance, its connection to the circle. Sarah listened intently, her expression growing graver with each revelation. She was shocked, appalled, but also intrigued. She recognized the magnitude of the story, the potential impact it could have, the danger it posed. "This is explosive," she said, her voice hushed. "If what you're saying is true, this could bring down the entire government." She agreed to help them, to publish their story, to expose the circle's crimes to the world. But she warned them that it would be a difficult and dangerous undertaking, that they would be facing powerful enemies. "They will come after you," she said. "They will try to discredit you, to silence you, to eliminate you. You must be prepared for anything." They spent the next few days working with Sarah, providing her with evidence, documents, names of contacts, anything that could corroborate their story and expose the circle's activities. They knew that time was running out, that Sir Arthur would be searching for them, that they had to act quickly before they were discovered. As they were preparing to go public with their story, Rose remembered something. Something that had been nagging at her, a loose end, a question that had remained unanswered. She remembered the unsent letter, the letter that Thomas had written to her, the letter that had contained the coded message revealing Sir Arthur's identity. She remembered the abrupt ending, the unfinished sentence, the sense that Thomas had been interrupted. She realized that there was more to the letter, something that they had overlooked, something that might hold a crucial piece of the puzzle. She pulled out the letter, unfolding it gently, her fingers tracing the faded ink. She read it again, slowly, carefully, searching for any clue, any hint, any detail that might have been missed. And then she saw it, a small, almost imperceptible smudge, located near the end of the letter, just below the unfinished sentence. It was a smudge of ink. But it wasn't just any ink. It was a specific type of ink, a rare and expensive ink, used only by a select few. Rose recognized the ink. It was the same ink that Sir Arthur Barrington used in his fountain pen, a pen he was rarely seen without. She realized that Sir Arthur had been present when Thomas wrote the letter, that he had interrupted him, that he had deliberately smudged the ink, to conceal something. She examined the smudge more closely, her mind racing. She realized that it wasn't just a smudge. It was a fingerprint, a partial fingerprint, smudged and distorted, but still recognizable. She realized that Sir Arthur had left his fingerprint on the letter, a silent testament to his presence, his involvement, his guilt. She showed the fingerprint to Thomas, her heart pounding with excitement. "This is it, Thomas," she said. "This is the proof. This is the evidence that will link Sir Arthur directly to the letter, to the mission, to everything." They knew that the fingerprint, combined with Thomas's scar and their testimony, would be enough to expose Sir Arthur and the Circle, to bring them to justice. They contacted Sarah Jenkins, informing her of their discovery, providing her with the letter and the fingerprint analysis. Sarah was amazed, thrilled, but also terrified. She knew that publishing this story would be the most dangerous thing she had ever done, that it would put her life and the lives of Rose and Thomas at risk. But she also knew that it was the right thing to do, that she had a duty to expose the truth, to bring the criminals to justice. She made the decision. She would publish the story. And she would break the promise that war and its devastating consequences had inflicted. Chapter 17. The Trial and the Testimony. The publication of the story, detailing Thomas's ordeal, the altered scar, Sir Arthur's fingerprint on the unsent letter, and the vast conspiracy of the circle, sent shockwaves through the nation. The public was outraged, demanding answers, demanding justice. The government, caught off guard, initially tried to dismiss the story as a fabrication, a conspiracy theory, but the evidence was overwhelming. Sir Arthur Barrington, his reputation shattered, his carefully constructed facade crumbling, was forced to resign from his position. He was arrested, along with several other high-ranking officials and prominent figures, all implicated in the circle's crimes. The trial was a media sensation, the courtroom packed with reporters, spectators, and government officials, all eager to witness the downfall of one of the most powerful and respected men in the country. Rose and Thomas, under heavy police protection, were the star witnesses, their testimony crucial to the prosecution's case. They recounted their story, their voices filled with emotion, their eyes revealing the pain and trauma they had endured. Thomas described his childhood, his recruitment into the circle, his mission, his betrayal by Miller, his escape, his amnesia, and his eventual recovery of memory. He showed the court his altered scar, the mark of the circle's depravity, a silent testament to their manipulation and control. Rose testified about her relationship with Thomas, her discovery of the unsent letter, her investigation, her encounter with Marie and Jean-Luc, her confrontation with Miller, and her eventual realization of Sir Arthur's treachery. She presented the letter, with Sir Arthur's fingerprint, as evidence, a damning piece of proof that linked him directly to the conspiracy. The defense attorneys, a team of highly skilled and ruthless lawyers, tried to discredit Rose and Thomas, painting them as liars, as delusional, as motivated by revenge. They attacked their credibility, questioned their motives, and attempted to poke holes in their story. But Rose and Thomas stood firm, their testimony unwavering, their truth undeniable. They had faced down death, betrayal, and unimaginable hardship. They would not be intimidated, they would not be silenced. The cross-examination was brutal, a relentless assault on their character and their sanity. The defense attorneys tried to portray Thomas as a traumatized war veteran, suffering from delusions and hallucinations, his memory unreliable, his testimony fabricated. They tried to portray Rose as a grieving widow, obsessed with finding a conspiracy where none existed, her judgment clouded by grief, and a desperate desire to believe that her fiancé was still alive. But Rose and Thomas held their ground, answering their questions calmly and truthfully, their voices ringing with conviction. They had the truth on their side, and they would not be swayed. The turning point of the trial came when Sarah Jenkins, the newspaper editor, took the stand. She testified about her investigation, her verification of Rose and Thomas's story, her belief in their credibility. She presented the court with additional evidence, documents, and testimonies that she had gathered, corroborating Rose and Thomas's claims and exposing the circle's vast network of influence and corruption. Her testimony was powerful, compelling, and ultimately devastating. It destroyed the defense's case, leaving Sir Arthur and his co-conspirators exposed, their crimes laid bare for all to see. The jury, after days of deliberation, returned with their verdict.
Guilty.
On all counts. Sir Arthur Barrington, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with defeat, was sentenced to life imprisonment. His co-conspirators received similar sentences, their reign of terror finally brought to an end. Rose and Thomas, standing outside the courtroom, surrounded by reporters and well-wishers, felt a sense of relief, of closure, of justice. But they also knew that the scars of the past, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal. They had endured too much, lost too much, to ever completely recover. They had exposed the circle, brought its leaders to justice, but they had also paid a heavy price. Their lives had been irrevocably changed, their innocence lost, their trust shattered. The victory, while hard-won, was bittersweet. Chapter 18. Flight to the Countryside. The aftermath of the trial was a whirlwind of media attention, public scrutiny, and lingering threats. While the circle had been exposed and its leaders imprisoned, the organization's reach was vast, its network of influence still potentially active. Rose and Thomas knew they were not entirely safe, that there were still those who would seek revenge, who would try to silence them permanently. Sir Arthur's conviction, though a significant victory, had also created a power vacuum, a scramble for control among the remaining members of the circle. There was a risk of splinter groups forming, of new conspiracies emerging from the ashes of the old. Rose and Thomas, exhausted and emotionally drained, decided to leave London, to seek refuge in a quiet, secluded place, far from the prying eyes of the media and the lingering threat of their enemies. They chose a small, remote cottage in the countryside, a place that held a special significance for them. The Cotswolds, a region of rolling hills and picturesque villages, a place where they had once dreamed of building a life together before the war had torn them apart. The cottage was modest but charming, with a thatched roof, stone walls, and a small garden filled with flowers. It was a world away from the chaos and danger of London, a sanctuary where they could begin to heal, to rebuild their lives, to find some semblance of peace. They spent their days walking in the fields, exploring the nearby villages, enjoying the simple pleasures of nature. They avoided contact with the outside world, cutting themselves off from the news, the media, the constant reminders of their ordeal. They focused on each other, on their relationship, on their shared love that had endured the years, the distance, the betrayal. They talked, they laughed, they cried, they slowly began to heal. Thomas, his memory fully restored, still struggled with the trauma of his past, the guilt of his unwitting involvement with the circle, the loss of his siblings. He had nightmares, flashbacks, moments of intense anxiety. But Rose was there for him, always, offering him comfort, support, and unwavering love. She helped him understand that he was not to blame, that he had been a victim, just like her, just like so many others. Rose, too, struggled with the aftermath of their ordeal. She had lost her home, her friends, her sense of security. She had faced down death, betrayal, and unimaginable hardship. But Thomas was there for her, too, offering her strength, companionship, and a renewed sense of hope. He helped her realize that she was stronger than she thought, that she had survived, that she could rebuild her life, that she could find happiness again. They spent their evenings by the fire, reading, talking, sharing their dreams and fears. They slowly began to rediscover the simple joys of life, the beauty of nature, the comfort of companionship. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, Thomas took Rose's hand, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft and gentle.
For everything.
"For believing in me, for saving me, for loving me." Rose smiled, her eyes filled with tears. "I never stopped loving you, Thomas," she said. "Not for a moment." He leaned in and kissed her, a tender, passionate kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment, their shared future. They knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that the scars of the past would always be with them. But they also knew that they could face anything as long as they had each other. They decided to stay in the countryside, to make a new life for themselves, far from the shadows of their past. They would build a home, a family, a future filled with love, laughter, and peace. They had fled, but the place they had chosen was for a new beginning. Chapter 19. The truth unveiled in the storm. The tranquility of their countryside retreat, while healing, couldn't entirely erase the lingering shadows of the past. Rose and Thomas had found solace in each other's company, but the weight of their shared experiences, the unanswered questions, and the ever-present threat of the circle's remnants still hung heavy in the air. One evening, a fierce storm raged outside, the wind howling, the rain lashing against the windows of their small cottage. The storm mirrored the turmoil within Rose, a growing unease that had been simmering beneath the surface of their newfound peace. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, some missing piece of the puzzle, some hidden truth that had yet to be revealed. Marie's dying words, "Thomas, he's not who you think he is," echoed in her mind, a constant, nagging reminder of the unanswered questions. As they sat by the fire, seeking refuge from the storm, Rose decided to confront Thomas, to delve deeper into his past, to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "Thomas," she said, her voice hesitant, "there's something I need to ask you. Something about Marie's last words." Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and understanding. He knew what she was referring to, the unspoken question that had hung between them since that fateful night at the windmill. "I know," he said, his voice low and heavy. "I've been avoiding it, afraid of what I might find." He explained that Marie's words had triggered a series of fragmented memories, glimpses of his childhood, images that didn't quite fit, pieces of a puzzle that he couldn't quite assemble. He remembered his father, the doctor, the man he had loved and respected. But he also remembered the other man, the man who had altered his scar, the man who had introduced himself as a friend of his father's. He remembered the village where he had grown up, the small, close-knit community, the sense of belonging, of family. But he also remembered a feeling of being different, of being watched, of being groomed. He remembered Marie, his sister, his protector, the woman who had saved his life. But he also remembered a sense of distance, a feeling that she was hiding something, that she knew more than she was letting on. He realized that Marie's dying words were not just about his connection to Jean-Luc and the Resistance Network. They were about something more, something deeper, something that went to the very core of his identity. I think my father wasn't my real father," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I think I was adopted." Rose listened, her heart aching for him, for the uncertainty he was facing, for the potential loss of his identity, his family, his past. "But how can you be sure?" she asked, her voice soft and gentle. Thomas explained that he had found a small, hidden compartment in his father's old medical bag, a compartment that contained a collection of documents, letters, and photographs. The documents revealed the truth. Thomas had been born in England, not France. His real name was Arthur Thomas Sinclair. He was the son of a wealthy and influential family, a family with connections to the Circle. His real father, Arthur Barrington Sr., had been a founding member of the Circle, a man obsessed with power and control. He had arranged for Thomas to be kidnapped as a baby, taken to France, and raised by a surrogate family, a family that was loyal to the Circle. He had been groomed from a young age to serve the Circle, to infiltrate the British military, to gather intelligence, to betray his own country. But something had gone wrong. Thomas had developed a conscience, a sense of morality, a loyalty to his adopted country. He had rebelled against his programming, turned against the Circle, and become their enemy. Marie, his adopted sister, had known the truth all along. She had protected him, hidden him, helped him escape. But she had also been bound by loyalty to her family, to her brother, Jean-Luc, who had remained loyal to the Circle. Rose realized that Marie's dying words, "Thomas, he's not who you think he is," were not a betrayal, but a warning. A warning about his true identity, his connection to the Circle, the danger he still posed. As the storm raged outside, mirroring the tempest of emotions within them, Rose and Thomas faced the truth, the devastating truth of his past. He was the son of his enemy. As rain lashed, thunder cracked, they looked into one another's eyes. This changed everything. Chapter 20. Atonement and a New Beginning. The revelation of Thomas's true parentage, his connection to the very organization he had fought to destroy, was a devastating blow. He was the son of Arthur Barrington Sr., the founder of the Circle, the architect of the conspiracy that had shattered their lives. The storm that had raged outside had passed, leaving behind a sense of eerie calm, a stark contrast to the turmoil within them. Thomas was grappling with a profound identity crisis, struggling to reconcile the man he had become with the legacy of his biological father. He felt betrayed, used, manipulated, his entire life a carefully constructed lie. He questioned his own morality, his own sense of self, wondering if he was inherently tainted by his father's sins. Rose, despite her own shock and pain, stood by him, offering him unwavering love and support. She helped him understand that he was not defined by his parentage, that he had made his own choices, that he had chosen a path of honor and integrity despite his origins. "You are not your father, Thomas," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "You are the man I love, the man who fought for justice, the man who risked his life to expose the circle. That is who you are." They decided to confront the past, to delve deeper into Thomas's family history, to understand the forces that had shaped his life and the motivations behind the circle's creation. They traveled to Thomas's birthplace, a grand estate in the English countryside, a place that held both painful memories and hidden truths. The estate was now deserted, abandoned after Sir Arthur Barrington's arrest, a symbol of the fallen empire of the circle. They searched the house, poring over old documents, letters, and photographs, piecing together the story of Thomas's family, their involvement with the circle, and their eventual downfall. They discovered that Arthur Barrington Sr. had been a charismatic but ruthless man, obsessed with power and control. He had founded the circle as a means to achieve his ambitions, to manipulate governments, to control resources, to shape the world according to his twisted vision. He had seen his son, Thomas, as a tool, a weapon to be used in his grand scheme. He had arranged for him to be kidnapped, raised in secrecy, and groomed to infiltrate the British military. But he had underestimated Thomas's strength of character, his innate sense of justice, his ability to resist his programming. Thomas had broken free from his father's control, chosen his own path, and become his father's nemesis. As they explored the estate, they found a hidden room, a secret chamber where Arthur Barrington Sr. had conducted his clandestine meetings, where he had plotted his conspiracies, where he had stored his secrets. In the room, they found a safe, a large, steel vault that held the key to the circle's remaining mysteries. They managed to open the safe, revealing its contents, a collection of documents, files, and recordings. The recordings were audio tapes, recordings of Arthur Barrington Sr.'s conversations with other members of the circle, revealing their plans, their strategies, their crimes. The recordings also revealed something else. Something that shocked Rose and Thomas to their core. Arthur Barrington Sr. had not acted alone. He had a partner, a co-conspirator, someone who had been with him from the very beginning, someone who had shared his vision, his ambition, his ruthlessness. The partner was Lieutenant David Miller. Miller, the man who had presented himself as an ally, the man who had betrayed them, the man who had killed Marie and Jean-Luc. He was not just a double agent. He was Arthur Barrington Sr.'s protégé, his heir apparent, the man who was intended to carry on the circle's legacy. The recordings revealed that Miller had been manipulating Thomas from the very beginning, orchestrating his amnesia, controlling his actions, using him as a pawn in their game. He had been the one who had altered Thomas's scar, marking him as a member of the circle, ensuring his loyalty, controlling his destiny. Rose and Thomas listened to the recordings, their hearts pounding with anger, disgust, and a renewed sense of determination. They had to expose Miller, to bring him to justice, to finally put an end to the circle's reign of terror. They knew it would be dangerous, that Miller was a ruthless and cunning adversary, that he would stop at nothing to protect himself. But they were ready. They had faced down death, betrayal, and unimaginable hardship. They would not be intimidated. They would not be silenced. They had the truth on their side. And they would fight for justice, for atonement, for a new beginning. The recordings were the final proof, the absolute evidence that they had needed. It was time. Epilogue. The revelation of Lieutenant Miller's true role as the heir to the circle, the mastermind behind Thomas's manipulation, and the continued threat, ignited a final, desperate push for justice. Rose and Thomas, armed with the damning recordings from Arthur Barrington Sr.'s vault, knew they had to act swiftly and decisively. They couldn't go to the authorities directly. Miller had proven his ability to infiltrate and corrupt even the highest levels of government. They needed a different approach, a way to expose him publicly, to strip away his carefully constructed facade and reveal his true nature to the world. They decided to leak the recordings to Sarah Jenkins, the intrepid journalist who had helped them expose Sir Arthur Barrington. They trusted her integrity, her courage, and her commitment to the truth. Sarah, initially shocked by the revelation of Miller's involvement, was also galvanized by the opportunity to finally bring down the entirety of the circle. She worked tirelessly, verifying the authenticity of the recordings, gathering additional evidence, and preparing a comprehensive expose that would shake the foundations of power. The publication of the story, accompanied by excerpts from the damning recordings, created a global sensation. Miller, exposed as a traitor, a murderer, and the leader of a vast criminal conspiracy, became an international pariah. He was forced to go into hiding, a fugitive from justice, hunted by law enforcement agencies around the world. The remaining members of the Circle, their organization shattered, their leaders disgraced, scattered, and went underground, their power and influence irrevocably broken. Rose and Thomas, finally free from the shadows of the past, could begin to rebuild their lives. They returned to their quiet cottage in the Cotswolds, their sanctuary from the storm, a place where they could heal, forgive, and find lasting peace. Thomas, though still haunted by the legacy of his father and the manipulations of Miller, found solace in Rose's unwavering love and support. He dedicated himself to atoning for the sins of his past, using his knowledge and experience to help others, to fight for justice, and to prevent similar tragedies from happening again. He became an advocate for victims of trauma, a voice for the voiceless, a champion of truth and integrity. He worked tirelessly to expose corruption, to challenge the powerful, and to build a better world, a world free from the shadows of the Circle. Rose, by his side, found her own path to healing and purpose. She became a writer, chronicling their experiences, sharing their story with the world, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of love, and the enduring quest for justice. They never forgot Marie and Jean-Luc, the siblings who had sacrificed their lives to protect Thomas. They honored their memory by establishing a foundation in their names, a charity dedicated to helping victims of war and political violence. Years passed, and the scars of the past slowly began to fade, replaced by a sense of peace, of acceptance, of forgiveness. Rose and Thomas, their love tested by fire, emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. They built a life together, a life filled with love, laughter, and a shared commitment to making the world a better place. They had children and grandchildren, creating a new generation, a legacy of hope and resilience. One evening, as they sat by the fire, their hands intertwined, their eyes reflecting the warmth of the flames, Thomas looked at Rose, his gaze filled with a profound love and gratitude. "We did it, Rose," he said, his voice soft and gentle. "We finally did it." Rose smiled, her eyes sparkling with tears of joy. "Yes, Thomas," she said. "We did it. Together." They had faced the darkness and emerged into the light, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Their journey had been long and arduous, filled with pain and loss, but it had also been a journey of redemption, of forgiveness, of love. And in the end, love had conquered all. The end.